The retreat's climax would come at Berezina River in late November, where the frozen waters would claim thousands more. As Russian forces finally closed the trap, the river became a slaughterhouse of desperation, its icy currents carrying away the last remnants of Napoleon's once mighty army. Berezina, crossing the river of death. The Berezina River crossing represented the final catastrophe of Napoleon's Russian campaign. By late November 1812, what remained of the Grande Armée reached the frozen river, with Russian forces closing in from three directions. Field Marshal Wittgenstein pursued from the north, Admiral Shishagov blocked the western bank, and General Miloradovich advanced from the east. Approximately 40,000 French combatants and 40,000 non-combatants faced the crossing, with winter temperatures dropping below -20 degrees Celsius (-4 degrees Fahrenheit). The river should have been frozen solid enough to walk across, but unseasonable thaws left dangerous patches of thin ice that couldn't support heavy loads. French engineers led by General Ebel worked against impossible odds to construct two wooden pontoon bridges across the 100-meter-wide river at Studienka. Working waist-deep in freezing water under constant Russian artillery fire, they used salvaged barn wood and demolished village houses to build the spans. Their tools froze to bare hands, and many engineers collapsed from hypothermia during 3 days of continuous labor. The artillery bridge took shape first, appearing somewhat stable by November 26. The second infantry bridge followed hours later, its planks slippery with ice and blood from injured workers. Panic erupted when Russian forces were spotted approaching. Thousands rushed the unfinished bridges before commanders could establish order. The artillery bridge collapsed under excessive weight shortly after midday, sending scores of men and horses plunging through ice floes into the river. Witnesses described trapped men clinging to broken timber until their frozen fingers lost grip. Engineers worked through the night to restore the span, while French rear guards fought desperately to hold off Wittgenstein's advancing troops. November 27 saw renewed attempts to cross under deteriorating conditions. Shishagov's forces intensified artillery barrages from the western bank, targeting both bridges and the massed troops waiting to cross. Russian gunners had the range precisely measured, dropping rounds directly onto the crowded approaches. A French officer recorded watching an entire company of veterans disintegrate under one well-placed barrage. 60 men wiped out in seconds while queuing for the crossing. The bridges became choked with corpses that had to be periodically cleared to maintain foot traffic. Discipline collapsed completely when the infantry bridge failed on November 28. A sudden shift in the current broke several supporting pontoons, sending hundreds tumbling into the freezing water. Strong swimmers found their limbs locking up within 30 seconds in the icy flow. The amount of gear soldiers carried made survival nearly impossible. French cavalry attempted rescues, but their weakened horses could make little headway against the current. French commanders took brutal measures to maintain order. Marshal Victor's rearguard corps held off Wittgenstein's troops at bayonet point, while engineers frantically repaired the bridges. Staff officers enforced strict crossing priorities. Artillery first, then Imperial Guard units, then line infantry. Thousands of stragglers found themselves barred from approaching, left to fend for themselves against the Russians. The West Bank became a killing ground as Shishagov's forces tightened their encirclement. Marshal Ney's battalions formed squares to repel cavalry charges, while their own remaining artillery provided what cover it could. Russian dragoons singled out isolated groups, overrunning them before nearby French columns could react. The frozen marshes alongside the river trapped many wounded men who couldn't move to safety before freezing to death where they fell. November 29 marked the final phase of the disaster. With Russian pressure intensifying, Napoleon ordered the bridges destroyed despite thousands still waiting on the east bank. Engineers set fire to the spans around 8:30 a.m., condemning approximately 10,000 stragglers to capture or death. Some attempted to swim across as the bridges burned, their silhouettes visible through the flames before disappearing under the ice. The crossing claimed approximately 25,000 French lives over 3 days. Half combatants, half civilians and stragglers. Another 25,000 became prisoners of war, many perishing in captivity. The river itself became a mass grave, its spring thaw later revealing thousands of corpses embedded in ice or washed up on banks. These losses came atop months of previous attrition. Of the 600,000 troops who invaded Russia that June, perhaps 40,000 soldiers remained effective after Berezina. Napoleon's leadership during the crisis showed flashes of his earlier brilliance mixed with growing desperation. His decision to deceive the Russians about crossing locations initially succeeded, buying critical time. Yet he also abandoned thousands of his own men when destroying the bridges early, prioritizing army remnants over individual lives. Russian commanders missed opportunities to inflict even greater damage. Shishagov hesitated to commit reserves that might have completely annihilated the French beachhead. Wittgenstein showed uncharacteristic caution against Victor's rearguard, allowing thousands more to escape than necessary. Their combined forces still inflicted devastating losses while suffering relatively light casualties themselves. About 6,000 Russian dead and wounded versus 10 times that number of French losses. The crossing's aftermath revealed the full scale of collapse. Discarded weapons, uniforms, and personal effects lined both riverbanks for miles. Frozen corpses stood upright where they had fallen, only melting months later. French staff officers burned regimental records and code books rather than let them be captured. Berezina became emblematic of the entire Russian campaign's failures. The French language adopted Berezina as shorthand for catastrophe. Veterans writing memoirs decades later still described nightmares about the frozen river. The disaster resulted more from geography and weather than Russian military action. The river, the ice, and the cold did most of the killing. Logistical deficiencies sealed the French fate well before arriving at the river. The Engineer Corps had started the campaign with insufficient pontoon bridging equipment, gambling they wouldn't need it in Russia's winter conditions. Without these fundamental preparations, no amount of bravery or sacrifice could overcome Berezina's physical challenges. The crossing marked the true death of the Grande Armée as an effective fighting force. While Napoleon would raise new armies in 1813, these lacked the experience and esprit de corps of the veterans lost in Russia. The campaign survivors struggled for years with physical and psychological wounds, missing limbs from frostbite, chronic respiratory conditions from freezing lung damage, or what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Strategically, Berezina confirmed Russian victory in the campaign. While Napoleon personally escaped to fight another day, his army ceased existing as a coherent unit. The myth of his invincibility shattered completely. European powers that had tolerated French domination now saw opportunities to rebel. Tactically, the crossing demonstrated both French resilience and Russian military limitations. Ebel's engineers achieved near miracles constructing functional bridges under hellish conditions. Yet Russian forces showed poor coordination between commands, repeatedly failing to concentrate against vulnerable points. The event's historical significance grew over time. Military academies studied Berezina as the ultimate lesson in failed campaign planning. Napoleon's refusal to acknowledge retreat until too late became shorthand for disastrous strategic inflexibility. German planners in 1941 would explicitly cite the 1812 campaign as what to avoid during Operation Barbarossa, then repeat many of the same mistakes against the same unforgiving landscape. Napoleon's Russian campaign proved no army could defeat geography itself. Of 600,000 men who crossed the Neman River, fewer than 100,000 returned. Russia's vast distances, brutal winter, and scorched earth tactics accomplished what no enemy general could: the destruction of Europe's most powerful military force without a decisive battle. Supply lines snapped, horses starved, and men froze where they stood. Modern militaries still study this campaign as a warning. Terrain and climate are merciless adversaries. Like a storm swallowing an army whole, Russia's geography remains its greatest defender, a lesson etched in ice and blood. No